Zachary, leader in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury. Let's give a huge round of applause for them. Can we again give a huge round of applause for them, please?
Zachary, hello. You've been a teacher all your life. Does this look an average classroom or is it bigger or smaller?
It's, an, it's an average classroom for a large lecture, but not usually. Much smaller groups I'm used to. It's fantastic to be at a festival like this with such audiences, both receptive and large. It's great.
We are here to discuss the second volume of your biography of, by anybody's reckoning, one of the 4 or 5 great English prose writers of the 20th century. And that was a very tall task to take on. And I always feel that when I read biographies that it's actually, in a way, the biography of 2 writers masquerading as one. There is somebody else whom we must discuss when we come to this book because you are also a writer. And actually, in reading this was pure pleasure on so many pages. And it wasn't just because it was about Bellow, it was the way you put it all together. So I want to know how you, before we get into your earlier work, how you got this gig, which was it a very coveted one, or was it, I'm not sure how the world of biography functions. Is it something for which there were many contenders?
Well, I got the job of writing Bellow's biography sort of by accident. In 2007, I had just finished 6 years writing of the biography of Kingsley Amis. And I wanted to write about an American, since I am an American. And Kingsley Amis was the most English of writers. And I also thought I couldn't handle another big narrative right away. So I thought I'd edit the letters of some American author. And the American author I could think of who was most like Kingsley Amis in that he was both a terrific writer and a figure of celebrity or notoriety, always in the newspapers, full of controversy and outrage. The figure I thought of was Norman Mailer. So I thought, what I'll do is I'll edit the letters of Norman Mailer. So my editor said, well, you have to contact Norman Mailer's agent. So I wrote to Norman Mailer's agent, who said, no, his letters are being edited by his best friend who lives right next to him and whose biography he's going to write and so forth. He said, but I'm coming to London and we could talk about other topics. Come meet me in London. So he came to London. It was about a week later. He said, meet me at Boodle's Club in St. James. So I went to Boodle's Club, and there was this figure smoking a big cigar and wearing what my wife refers to as an 18-piece suit. And he said, well, have you any ideas? And by this time I had looked up his client list, and there was Saul Bellow, and I thought, that's what, I'll edit the letters of Saul Bellow. So I said, well, what about Saul Bellow? And he said, that's a great idea. I'm meeting the Bellow team next week at the Lotus Club in New York on Wednesday. And he said, where will you be on Wednesday? I said, where would you like me to be? He said, by your telephone. So he said, now come, let's have dinner. And he took me to this restaurant at Jermyn Street, a sort of fancy area, and a very fancy, eye-wateringly expensive restaurant that sold fish. And he plied me with fish and wine and stories about Andy Warhol. And the only awkward moment at this dinner came when I realized that he was talking about a biography and I was talking about an edition of the letters. And he said, no, the letters are being edited by Ben Taylor. I want you to write biography. And after all the wine and glamorous stories and so forth, I found that my anxieties about completing another long narrative had evaporated, and I came out of the meeting about to become Saul Bellow's biographer. He said, when the Amos volume comes out in the United States, I want you to come to New York and meet the Bellow team. And this team consisted of an old lawyer friend of Bellow's who he used to have threaten anyone who said things he didn't like with an injunction, and then Janice Bellow herself. And I had been warned about, Janice Bellow was Bellow's widow, and I'd been warned about her. Martin Amos said to me, she's barbarically loyal, and she thinks that Saul Bellow is at least as great a novelist as Tolstoy, and so do I. And I met her. She was terrific. She said she wouldn't interfere. She said she'd give me total access to all the papers. She gave me the family address book and wrote a letter for me saying anyone I contacted she hoped would help me because she was in favor of this job. And she said she didn't care about all the women who came before her. So those people I met, and the other person I had to meet was one of two literary advisors to the Bellow estate. Philip Roth was one of them, and the other one was Martin Amos. And that Martin Amos liked my biography of his father pretty much accounts for how I got the job of writing Bellow's biography. And I should just add finally that I had been a fan of Bellow's writing, knew it pretty well, and was delighted, honored to be given this job.
It's a story with a strange mix of luck, fate, and some kind of willpower and preparation in your case with the right man. But am I right in guessing that this was at this time there already was a biography of Bellow in circulation? And what did it mean that one, you've been given this job, but you would in some ways be covering territory that somebody had very recently done? I mean, it's not very common in literary biography for two biographies to be so close to each other in time, isn't it?
Yes, there was a substantial biography written by James Atlas that came out in 2000, and Bellow lived another 5 years. Towards the end of the genesis of this biography by Atlas, he lost the trust of Bellow and his family, and Bellow advised his friends towards the end not to cooperate with Atlas, and he gave him access to most, but not all, of his papers. There are 350 boxes of Bellow's papers at the Regenstein Library at the University of Chicago. He was famous quite early on in his life and had secretaries who kept everything that he received and dictated letters for him. So there's a huge correspondence. And he was also a madly prolific writer there were many drafts of his work, a number of unpublished novels, some of which Atlas had access to, but not all of them. And after Bellow died in 2005, 150 boxes of these 350 boxes were deposited in the library, and these were papers and materials that Atlas didn't have. So in addition to having 5 years of Bellow's life to explain, I had all this material that was new. And by the time the book came out, it will have been 18 years since Atlas's biography came out. And that seems to me a decent enough interval for a biography on a writer of this stature.
When you agree to write someone's biography of a writer of the kind of import that Saul Bellow had, in effect, you're kind of saying you're going to spend the next 10 years of your life, you're almost like Saul Bellow's sixth wife, in a way. Perhaps even they didn't have sort of like as much, we do know that there are many things that like, they didn't know about his life. And part of his life was spent in, and that's why your biography is called Love and Strife. He's trying to keep the different stories going at the same time. So in a way, you have to arrive to clear it all up, isn't it? And put it back together.
Well, you have to try to put it, I mean, my aims were threefold. I mean, I wanted to show what it was like to meet this man at different points of his life. But also I wanted to show what it was like to be him, to give a sense of his sort of mental territory, his mental landscape. But over and above that, the reason one would write a biography about a writer is I think he's an absolutely brilliant writer, and I wanted readers of my biography to be given lots of examples of what's beautiful, insightful, widening of one's consciousness about reading Bellow. So those were the main aims, and the one that makes the bringing things together so difficult is that I try to imagine what would go through his mind on a daily. And you know, it might be, how do I change the scene in this novel? How will that bit be received? What shall I wear tonight to the dinner party? Is my son still mad at me for that remark I made? To give a general sense of the consciousness of the man. When Bellow died, Philip, just before he died, he got quite depressed. Philip Roth told his agent the agent told Philip Roth that Bellow seemed sort of depressed. And Roth said, well, you'd be depressed too if that universe was closing on you. And he had a sort of enormous universe. I didn't think of myself as a writer until I started writing biographies, and the business of weaving all these different aspects of the life together was the most interesting as well as challenging aspect of it. And lots of it was love and lots of it was strife.
This brings up a very interesting point, which is that I think if one were to gather literary biographers in a room today, the best ones, you'd find a lot of them are, one might say, professionals of the craft. That is, they set out at this fairly early in life, and that's what they're mainly known for. In your case, that's a bit different. As far as I can tell, in your 30s, 40s, and early 50s, you'd produced a lot of, you were an academic and you'd written about Blake, you put together collections of essays on British fiction. Your background was textual. So I want to understand, not just Saul Bellow as a writer, which I get from your book, but what about you as a writer? When suddenly, and this comes, we have to start with Kingsley Amis. When you get that job, what are you telling yourself about literary biography? Do you have to go out and read lots of it? Do you have to make up your mind about what kind of paths you're going to work, what kinds of paths methodologically that you're going to follow from there on?
Well, I'd read some biographies, but I mean, I wasn't a devotee of literary biographies. It was another accident, my getting the Amis to do. I was a friend of Kingsley Amis's son, and we used to play tennis together, and it sort of fell into my lap. First editing the Amis letters, and then writing the life. I had written a book about the revision and romantic authorship, about why poets change their poems, and what obligations editors had when they had different versions of the poems to publish. Should they publish the first versions, or should they publish the final version? And I was interested in the reasons why poets revised their works, and whether or not it was true that, as the Romantics said, poetry ought to come as naturally as the leaves to the tree. In fact, if you looked at their manuscripts, they revised all the time. It was a myth that the best work was the first impulse. And in this revision book, there was a chapter about the peasant poet John Clare, who was at that time conventionally thought of as having been hampered or constricted by his editor, a man named John Taylor. And I had looked at the correspondence between Clare, who was a poet of the Romantic period, the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, the correspondence between him and his editor. And if you looked closely at it, you could see that Clare wanted his poems to be edited. He wanted his grammar to be regularized. He wanted his publisher to help him to reach a large audience so that he could cease being an agricultural laborer and spend his time writing poetry. And I wrote this chapter which sort of told the story of the relationship. And Martin Amis had read this chapter and he'd liked it, and that sort of led him to think that I could do this sort of work.
Very good, because it brings up the point, which is very much a part of the daily drama of Saul Bellow's life, other than the familial issues, revision and rewriting. In fact, am I wrong? Isn't that there a book about this aspect of his life called Vision and Revision in Saul Bellow by Daniel Fuchs?
Yes.
And so it's clearly, and we know also from his editors that he liked working on galleys, and I can understand that because there's something about the book that's very dramatic when it arrives in its penultimate form, isn't it? When you suddenly see what the problems are with the text.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us something about, one, that aspect of his life and what kind of textual analysis you could then bring to bear on these aspects of his work?
Right. Well, Bellow was one of those novelists who would begin in a kind of, a little bit like a frenzy. He would have an idea and start writing, and usually come up with something of about 100 typed pages. And then he'd look up and see what he'd done and have to construct a novel out of it. It's not as though he had the whole thing planned. He didn't have little cards giving the life story of the characters. It was a sudden burst. And you often find at the end of his novels a rush of plot, so that all the novels end with a slightly farcical tone, because he's got to put so many parts together that he really hadn't planned before. There's a kind of rush of plot at the end that some people find puzzling, but often works in terrific ways. The other thing about him is that he wasn't someone who made minor alterations. If he didn't like something in the first 50 pages of what he wrote, he started from the beginning again. He also didn't date his books, his revisions, so you never knew which came first, and it's very hard to figure it out. This man, Daniel Fuchs, who wrote this book, Vision and Revision in Saul Bellow's writing, has done a terrific job. But he too couldn't be certain of the different editions coming up. You have to know the material, the manuscript material, the unpublished material, to tell his development as a writer. Just one. Sometimes he writes one kind of a novel, and the next novel is completely different. He wrote Augie March, this enormous, sprawling novel. When asked what Augie March was about, Bellow used to say, well, it's about 100 pages too long. And then afterwards, the most controlled, tightest and slightest of his novels, Seize the Day, was. How did he go from this great sprawling work to this most controlled of novels. Well, if you know the archive, you know that he didn't go from one to the other, that there was an intermediary novel which exists in over 200 typed pages called Memoirs of a Bootlegger's Son, which is moving towards the control of Seize the Day. So if you want to know the story of this man's development as an artist, you have to know the unpublished material, of which there was a lot, perhaps a dozen manuscripts of almost 100 pages that never got published. So learning this helps you to understand his development as a writer.
Well, the second volume of your biography is called Love and Strife, and it's clear that the two are very closely connected in this part of his life. And much of the first 200 or 300 pages of the story in the second volume is about him being married, him having affairs sometimes with women much younger than him, and some of them don't seem to know about each other. And I wanted. You are very admirably sort of even-handed in sort of reconstructing the exchanges between all of these characters who are sort of floating around each other, sometimes in the same town. And I wonder, though, if you think, in his case, there is some connection between is the connection between power and creativity, or sexuality and creativity, or is it all a giant complex? Because he seems to enjoy this part of his life very much.
Yes, he enjoyed that part of his life very much. There is a connection, I think, between creativity and the problems he had, and the reason he was married 5 times.
Yes.
I once asked his friend, the novelist Richard Stern, who lives in Chicago, why it was that Bellow got married 5 times. And he said, well, he would meet a woman to whom he was attracted. All the women he was attracted to were very intelligent, accomplished, and very attractive. And he said, well, he'd meet these women and he'd project all kinds of ideal qualities onto them. And then when they married, he'd realize that they weren't perfect or ideal, but they had imperfections, and this would bother him, and finally it would push him away. And I told this theory of Richard Stern's to another colleague of theirs at the University of Chicago, some of you might know, Wendy Doniger, her name is. And I said, well, you know, what Richard Stern said was that he'd have all these sort of ideal qualities that he'd attribute to these girls, and then they couldn't realize them. And she said to me, well, that's what love is, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's what love is. But that's one theory. When I asked his 5th wife, Janice Bellow, why he had married 5 times, her answer was, he was looking for me. No. Now, I don't know if that's your idea of what love is, but my tendency was not to tell anybody what I thought love was, but simply to lay out the 2 possibilities and let the reader decide which was the one that seemed more plausible. And at many points in the narrative, when there were different ways to explain why Saul Bellow behaved, how he could possibly have done what he'd done with one woman and then gone to another, and so forth and so on, when there are many ways to describe this, I simply give the many ways and try, as far as possible, to leave it to the reader to decide which were the most plausible, likely ones. And that's partly the reason why the book is so long.
Since we're considering these explanations, what about if we think as an explanation of this that he knew that although he knew that he would be disappointed, he still wanted to have someone to idealize, and as part of what it means to live. One may be disappointed, but that doesn't mean that one doesn't live that way.
That's right. But he also had another I think he got married 5 times because, well, he once said to a friend, he didn't want to be the sort of person, he didn't want to believe he was the sort of person who couldn't be monogamous or faithful. And it wasn't the case that all his marriages dissolved because he was unfaithful. There were other reasons for the marriages to dissolve, but he did need love in his life, and also he was extremely attractive, could be perfectly charming, and he was the most famous novelist and the most feted novelist, the most prize-bestrewn novelist in the United States, and he never really had to pursue women. He was pursued by them. He was a kind of rock star in a way in which, I don't know if that's still going on now. There's Karl Ove Knausgaard. You're a very handsome person. Perhaps you'll be the Indian rock star of the literary world. I don't know. So, I mean, it's not as though he was not an abuser or anything like that. He was approached by lots of women who were attracted to him.
There is one instance in the book where it's clear that he's being pursued by a woman. It's when he's with one of them and somebody else comes running up the staircase and knocks on the door trying to bust his story. Yeah. And what happens there is very dramatic. I wonder if you can explain why does he, when he realizes who has come to visit, why does he go and hide his manuscript in the refrigerator?
Yeah, he had a very serious girlfriend in New York who remained a friend pretty much throughout his life, even after they ceased being lovers. But at this time they were lovers. And he had also fallen for a woman in Chicago. And he sort of talked about marriage to both of them. He also talked about marriage to a third one who was soon to be on the scene. Anyway, the one from New York was staying with him in Chicago. And when the one from Chicago realized that she was there, she went to confront Bellow. And Bellow got word of her coming just before she arrived. And the manuscript he was working on, he hid in the refrigerator. This was the one thing that was most important to him. There was a terrible confrontation in which this woman who'd come from Chicago and saw the woman from New York there, he said, she's helping me with some typing. She said, no, she's not. Do you want to go off with me? Do you want to marry me? And he couldn't answer. A terrible scene. I don't know, it was another era, but this is a sort of thing that happened more than once in his life.
One of the great pleasures of reading Bellow is his descriptions of the things of daily life and how they suddenly seem to acquire a new vividness and beauty on the page. And in that context, it's especially ironical, I feel, that the reason for one of his marriages beginning to dissolve is that, in the case of Susan Glassman, is that she seems to think that her job is to make sure that they live in as stylishly as possible and puts together the sort of very beautifully put together household with expensive furniture and crockery and dinner parties where he begins to feel uncomfortable.
Yes. This was a spectacularly beautiful woman, Susan Glassman, who Bellow was introduced to by Philip Roth. Philip Roth had come to a lecture Bellow was giving at the University of Chicago and brought his current girlfriend, this woman Susan Glassman, and she wanted to meet Bellow after the lecture, and she noticed that there was a line of women waiting to meet Bellow after the lecture to introduce themselves, to have their books signed and so forth. And she joined this line and then started an affair with Bellow, and they eventually married. And someone remembers seeing Susan Glassman for the first time after they had married, standing at the side of a room, watching a line of women coming to greet and meet Bellow when he had given a lecture. But she was a very intelligent woman. She'd been to Harvard and done some graduate work and so forth. But she had an ideal of being a literary hostess. She wanted, she had them buy an enormous, great, beautiful apartment in Chicago overlooking the lake. And she brought in an interior designer to cover the floor with a green shag carpet and to mirror the study where Bellow lived. Bellow had lived most of his life, even though by then he was quite rich and famous, in more bohemian settings. And this apartment made him very uncomfortable. He called it the Vatican. His son Adam described this apartment as its decor as Chicago dentist. It was, and he really wanted to write. He didn't want to be a writer. I mean, he was happy to be he was less interested in being a writer, though perfectly interested in the perks that went with it, than he was in being able to write. And he wanted his domestic circumstances to free him every morning until 1 o'clock to do his writing. He spent every morning till 1 o'clock doing his writing. And then, unlike Kingsley Amis, who spent his afternoons getting drunk at his club, Bellow went out into the world and exercised enormous influence. If you wanted a job, if you wanted a publisher, if you wanted a fellowship, if you wanted an agent, if you wanted a magazine assignment, he could get it for you. And if he approved of you and what you did, he could help you. And if he disapproved of you, he would do what he could to make sure you didn't get it. According to his lights, he was serving literature in that way. And he taught throughout his life. Even when he was the richest and most famous of American novelists, he took on the job of chairing his department. I mean, most people run a mile from that kind of administrative responsibility, but he took it on. He led a busy life away from his desk, which is partly why there was so much to report of interest, because it tells you about the man in telling his life story. But the main thing is the writing always came first. It came before everything else, and most things had to be sacrificed. He had 3 sons from these 5 marriages, each from a different mother. And he had taken his revenge on these 3 mothers in novels written after they separated. Not easy for the sons. When the sons came to stay with him, he was a very good father after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, even when they were on Cape Cod on holiday, even when they were in the Hamptons at the beach. The present girlfriend had to take care of them, play catch with them and so forth until the writing was finished. Then Bellow would go out and show them things, take them to the beach, read them stories by Jack London and Dickens and so forth. He was a very affectionate but always distant father, and this caused immense problems and tensions between him and his children. So with Susan Glassman Bellow, with the sons, it was the writing that came first, and this caused great difficulties in the relationships.
One might divide 20th century novelists in many kinds of ways, but a private one I have and I like looking for is those who use the word soul unironically and those who always use it in a kind of sarcastic way. And it's very clear that Saul Bellow is in the first camp, that soul is a very important word for him. Where is that the place of that word in his vision of fiction?
Well, I always think of, when people ask me what I think is so terrific about Bellow as a writer, one of the first things I mention, and that lots of people have felt, is that he's a fantastic noticer. He sees more in the world than you do, and he makes you see it in a way that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, his imitative powers, his powers of mimesis are nonpareil. I mean, he can make you see anything in that sort of terrific way. So he's in the material world and sees it perfectly. But he's a romantic in another respect. And one of the reasons, aside from the fact that Martin Amis supported me and praised my biography of his father, that I got the job, is that I had worked on romantic poetry before, and Saul Bellow and Roth liked that I knew all about the romantic poets. And like the romantic poets, Bellow thought that attention to the particulars of the material world was a way of looking into and beyond that world, into a realm, in some ways, above the material realm. He thought that way, particularly about descriptions of characters' faces. He would see in the set of the eyes, or the jaw, or in the appearance of the gums, or in the way the hair grew, something expressive of character. He was almost a kind of phrenologist. And this ability to, the phrase is Wordsworth's, to see into the life of things, okay? To go beyond the material world in some ways, led him to also, gave affirmation to his sense that there was a thing called the soul, and that the soul was a way of connecting, or was that part of you that connected to a world beyond the material world. He was in love with the material world and repulsed by it at the same time. He was sure there was a spiritual world, but could never fully commit himself to it. I associate the word soul and the world of spirit with a love world, and I associate strife with the striving, the hostility, the combativeness, the aggression, the ambition of the material world, and both of them coexist in Bellow's writing.
One of the problems of writing a biography of someone one has never met is that you have to kind of put the person together from testimonies of others. And on that round of the world of Bellow, who was the most interesting person you came across, and what did that encounter do to you?
Well, the most interesting, by far the most interesting and lovable of the characters I interviewed was a man named David Pels. When I went to Chicago in 2008 to go through the papers and to start researching the biography, I also had this address book, and I had to meet these people. And David Pels, when I met him in January of 2008, was 92 years old. And basically, if you got a phone call from me, it was not a good sign, because I had to get the oldest people first, and Dave Pels was 92. Bellow had gone to high school with this man, David Pels, and had known him all his life. And like many of Bellow's high school friends in Chicago, they grew up on the west side of Chicago in a place called Humboldt Park. It was an immigrant neighborhood full of first-generation immigrants from Scandinavia, Jewish immigrants, lots of Poles and so forth. It was a working-class immigrant neighborhood. But like many of Bellow's friends, Dave Pels had made it, and as you make it, you move further east towards Lake Michigan, and he was situated on the 35th floor of a condominium overlooking the lake and overlooking Belmont Harbor. So I went to interview this guy. It was 9:30 in the morning. I rang his bell, and the door was open, and here was this 92-year-old guy, tough, strong-looking, and like Bellow, a dude. He was wearing, I remember, a cashmere sweater shirt with the collar turned up. He had spent his life as a builder and contractor, But he had literary and intellectual interests, and his apartment was covered with copies not just of the New Yorker, but of the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books and the TLS and so forth. Anyway, so I was talking to him. He had absolutely wonderful stories. He was a very street character. He was a friend of Nelson Algren's as well. He knew all about gambling, racetracks, gangsters, and so forth. He was Bellow's entree to the street. So we talked till about 12:30. It was 12, actually, and he said, "You know, Zach, I feel like some vodka. Would you like some vodka?" So sure, I said. So he went out to the kitchen. He came back with 2 tumblers full of vodka and ice. I mean, up to here. And we hadn't had anything to eat since 9:30. He hadn't offered me anything. And he talked to me for another 30, 45 minutes, during which time he consumed the entire tumbler of vodka. And I'd had about 1 or 2 sips. And I said, "Now, Dave, I have to get back to my office now. I can't talk anymore. I hope we could talk." He said, "Sure." He said, "Where's your office?" I said, "Well, it's at the University of Chicago. It's on the south side." And Dave's apartment was on the north side. He said, "Really? I'll drive you there." Well, here I was, this 92-year-old man who hadn't eaten anything, as far as I could see, since 9:30 in the morning, and who just drunk a tumbler full of vodka. And as I was sort of hesitating, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, it pisses me off when people think I can't drive." So I had to make this decision, and I thought, well, I'd already done this very dangerous thing of agreeing to write biography of this contentious figure. So I said, in for a pound, in for a penny. Okay, Dave, you can drive me. It was snowing, it was freezing, it was January. We went down the 35 flights of the condo to the basement, where Dave called for what he referred to as his big-assed Honda. And this gleaming Honda came up, and we got into it. And the garage door opened. It was snowing outside. And you can get from the north of Chicago all the way down to the south side where the university is, passing all of the city, by taking the Lakeshore Drive, a kind of freeway. So we go out onto the street and onto the freeway, and Dave drives like a dream, neither too fast nor too slow, pointing out all the tallest buildings and the most beautiful buildings. And before I knew it, I was at my office door at the University of Chicago on the south side. He was this amazing guy. Just one other thing, that he said he'd take me on a tour of Chicago, the places that Bellow lived in. And we did one of these tours. Again, it was in the winter, and he took me to this place that figures in Bellow's novel Humboldt's Gift. It's the Russian Baths on Division Street on the west side of Chicago. And in Bellow's time, the Russian Baths were full of these men from the immigrant communities. But by 2008, Humboldt Park, where he grew up, was now populated by Puerto Ricans and Hispanics. And we pulled up in front of the Russian Baths and in our winter overcoats, and Dave marched us right up the steps and down into the cellar, where in our overcoats, we saw all these enormously fat, naked men who said, come on in, come on in. Dave wanted to show me how the Schwitzbad, the bath worked and so forth, and we did, and out we went. And Bellow was given exactly the same tour by Dave, and he wrote about the baths in Humboldt's Gift, and I always try to bring along, it's a paragraph, this description of the Russian baths, and so I'll read it to you so you'll get a sense of what Saul Bellow's writing is like if you don't know it. So here's a description of the Russian baths on Division Street in the novel Humboldt's Gift. The patrons of the Russian baths are cast in an antique form. They have swelling buttocks and fatty breasts as yellow as buttermilk. They stand on thick pillar legs affected with a sort of creeping verdigris or blue cheese mottling of the ankles. After steaming, these old fellows eat enormous snacks of bread and salt herring or large ovals of salami and dripping skirt steak, and they drink schnapps. They could knock down walls with their hard, stout, old-fashioned bellies. Things are very elementary here. You feel that these people are almost conscious of obsolescence, of a line of evolution abandoned by nature and culture. So down in the superheated subcellars, all these Slavonic cavemen and wood demons with hanging laps of fat and legs of stone and lichen boil themselves and splash ice water on their heads by the bucket. Upstairs on the television screen in the locker room, little dudes and grinning broads make smart talk or leap up and down. They are unheeded. Mickey, who keeps the food concession, fries slabs of meat and potato pancakes, and with enormous knives he hacks up cabbages for coleslaw, and he quarters grapefruits to be eaten by hand. The stout old men, mounting in their bedsheets from the blasting heat, have a strong appetite. Below, Franish the attendant makes steam by sloshing water on the white-hot boulders. These lie in a pile like Roman ballistic ammunition. To keep his brains from baking, Franish wears a wet felt hat with the brim torn off. Otherwise, he is naked. He crawls up like a red salamander with a stick to tip the latch of the furnace, which is too hot to touch. And then on all fours, with testicles swinging on a long sinew and the clean anus staring out, he backs away, groping for the bucket. He pitches in the water, and the boulders flash and sizzle. There may be no village in the Carpathian where such practices still prevail. So you take Saul Bellow to the Russian baths, and he gives you this. So it's good.
I think one of the things you do very well in your book, which is what makes it such a pleasure, is that you get to read whole paragraphs like this in the course. And I think this is one of the underestimated aspects of the biographer's art, isn't it? To know what to put in from the actual subject of study.
Yes, well, I wanted to fill my book with passages like these terrific comic and other passages that show sort of a kind of deeper sense of Bellow's commitment to the world and sense of its material world and sense of its inadequacies. And you know, if your aim is to get people to see what's so wonderful about this writer, then you have to give lots of examples. And for a variety of reasons, Bellow is not taught as much as he should be in universities, and my book is an attempt to get people to read him.
I have so many more questions I want to ask you, but I do think we should make some room for the audience. Does anybody want to ask? Have a question to ask? You do? Yes. Why don't we start there? Is someone going to go across with a... I mean, this room is small enough that... You are?
Hello, sir.
Oh, yes.
What I want to know is that when you're writing a biography about someone and you're reading so much about them, researching so extensively about them, does it ever happen that their life kind of influences yours so much that the lines blur between whom you are writing about and who you are?
Yes, I guess it does. I wear a fedora hat, which is what Saul Bellow wore, in order to see what it's like to be a person who wears a hat in a world where people don't wear those sorts of hats anymore. So I thought it looked very cool. It wasn't just as an attempt to, to see the world as he saw it. But I started to adopt this, this sense of oneself, a little bit of a sense of oneself as a Jude. I also came to admire his rigor and regularity as a writer. And he had these little rituals that seemed to me attractive. He had a certain kind of breakfast. He'd have bananas with his cereal, only 7 slices. And he thought about the world so carefully that I thought, well, there might be something in this only 7 slices business. So I've been having 7 slices in my cereal. Now, whether this has done me any good, I have no idea. But these things are starting to happen. We had to go to all the places Saul Bellow went to. And my very patient wife said at the end of 10 years working on this man, that she would never go to any place if Saul Bellow had been there. We had to go only to places where Saul Bellow had not been. So, I mean, her sense of, and all my friends, they'd heard an awful lot about Saul Bellow during this time. But I didn't become a compulsive womanizer. I didn't, I think I was a better dad, but then it was easier for me to be a better dad than Bellow was. I'm not sure whether it somehow or other might have affected my sense of just how open I could be in expressing my dislikes or the things that irritated me. I mean, I think I might have been made a little bolder by my contact with a man who just made it clear what he felt about things. I think I might be a little harder because of my continued contact with him.
Who was next? There was someone there? Yes, if you just stand up and, huh? Yes, you please. After that, yeah. Go on.
My name is Atul. In the course of researching this book, I'm sure you got a good sense of what kind of writing, not only the kind of stuff he edited out, the kind of stuff he liked reading. Do you think, after having written all this, do you think he would approve of your writing? Do you think Saul Bellow, what would he have critiqued about your writing of his life?
I didn't quite get it.
Does writing about a great writer make you a better writer, kind of by a sort of osmosis in a way?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the way you become a good writer is to read a lot of good writing, and writing the biography of a good writer. And I mean, and there's always something terrific, a phrase, a sentence, whatever it might be, even in the most perfunctory business letter. And the more subjected you are to good writing, the more it infects you. It may be, I mean, one of Bellow's great accomplishments as a writer is that he brought to high literature a wide range of reference, from the street to the ivory tower, from hamburgers to Heraclitus. And he wrote in a kind of loose, jazzy style, unembarrassed by the range of popular reference in his writing. And I think it may have loosened up my writing. I hope that in my academic writing, I was not as bad as some of my colleagues who were sort of in love with technical vocabulary and jargon and so forth and so on. I was never like that, but writing about Bellow loosened my prose style a bit and gave it a little bit more verve and energy. I'm not Saul Bellow, but I think this helped.
Someone there wanted to ask.
Hello, sir. I have recently started reading Humboldt's script, a part of my syllabus. which by far is going great, okay. But while reading this book, I was wondering that while writing about Saul Bellow's life, did you come across any such event or any such event of Bellow's life which might have taken you by surprise, like, oh man, he can do this too, sort of event, you know?
Things that surprised me in writing about Bellow?
Something about Bellow's life that you had not anticipated finding out. Isn't that what you're asking?
Yes. No, I did have lots of surprises.
Were there any shocks, though?
Shocks about Bellow. I don't think well, let's see. There was a period when, to be about women, there was a period in which he seemed absolutely serious. His letters suggest this, in suggesting the possibility of marriage to 3 women at the same time. And I don't think he was just trying a style out. I think somehow or other he hadn't decided, or how he felt he could keep this going, I have no idea. I found it incomprehensible. So surprising in that I would never think a person would be able to do this or would want to do it. Along the way, going through the archives, I found all sorts of things that were surprising. I think I made a note of it. Let me see. I found a couple of things that I thought were sort of terrific. Let's see here.
Although, Zachary, we only have 2 minutes left, so maybe
Okay.
you want to take another question.
Now, the thing I was going to read you was, there comes a point in writing about I had to list all the various awards he won round about the time of the Nobel Prize. I mean, he had 1 million awards, and it would be very boring to do it, but I found a letter written to him by the director of the Miss USA competition, saying that all the candidates to be Miss USA had decided that he was their favorite writer, and would he agree to be a judge of the Miss USA competition. And as an inducement, he was told by this official of the committee of the jury that previous jurors had included Leon Uris and Jacqueline Suzanne. Well, Bellow was quite snobbish about these matters, and he refused to take the job on. But it helped to write this sort of boring paragraph of all the things he'd won to end with, he had an opportunity to be a judge in the Miss USA contest. There are several other surprises like that.
Time for one last quick question, and then we have... Is there someone else? Yes, you there.
We judge ourselves based on our intentions, and other people judge us based on our actions. So when you're exploring someone's life who is no longer living, how do you kind of take those actions and determine the intentions? And speaking to that, the people that are getting you to write about this person, maybe they tend to want it to be more of a eulogy than it is an actual account of this person. And so how do you balance the two?
Well, there's this Greek or classical notion of personality, which is that you are the sum of your actions. And a more modern sense of personality is that you are your actions and you are the person behind the actions. So that you might, for instance, call yourself a socialist, but in the end send your children to a private school. To the Greek or classical mentality, you were a person who sent your child to private school, so you were not a socialist. But that's different from someone who does it without thinking about it, and someone who agonizes internally about whether or not it's the right thing to do to send your child to private school, or it's the wrong thing to disadvantage your child by not sending him because you're a socialist and so forth. The person, in the modern sense, is the person I'm interested in, a combination of the things the person does and the mental mental energy and activity that went into or behind the actions. So I'm interested in both. And what I try to do is not judge. The only thing I judge is the writing. But there are often different explanations for the behavior. You have to think a bit about the motive, though that should not cancel out the final act. Does that help? Is that? Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for. I hope this was a fruitful hour for you. Thank you to Zachary Leader. And please do read the book. Zachary will be at the author's tent after this to sign your copies.
We wish to thank our speakers, Zachary Leader, Chandrahas Choudhury. Zachary will be signing their book at the book signing area left to Darbar Hall. Next session coming up at 2:30.